The Council and the Institute would like to thank the Japan Society for its special assistance in arranging this evening's program. Our subject tonight, and this is a difficult one, the title is Japan's Reverse Investment to the United States, Past, Present, and Future. Our guest, Dr. Mabuchi, is General Manager of the Research Headquarters of the Industrial Bank of Japan. Now, for your edification, the Industrial Bank of Japan, the banks in Japan, advise Japanese corporations on reverse investment, and the International Bank of Japan is Japan's largest. Dr. Mabuchi has been with the International Bank of Japan since 1956 and served as Deputy Chief Representative of IBJ in New York from 1969 through 1972. Returning to the bank's Tokyo headquarters, he was manager of Foreign Department through 1975, and for 3 years thereafter as Deputy General Manager of the Corporate Planning Department. From 1978 to 1981, Dr. Mabuchi was the Deputy General Manager of the Secretariat. Dr. Mabuchi holds a doctorate degree in economics from Keio University in Tokyo, Japan's oldest university, and is teaching once a week at Hoshei University, Tokyo, and Tokai University, Kanagawa. Dr. Mabuchi is the author of a study of the bank holding company movement in the United States. He also has written extensively on international banking matters in Japanese academic and business journals. The timing of this discussion is most appropriate. Of course, we arranged this. That he would be here in the midst of one of the greatest financial crises that this country and the world has ever faced. And we look forward to a well-informed discussion. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Mabuchi.
Thank you, Mr. Patterson. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and privilege for me to be here before you tonight to speak on the difficult subject on Japanese investment in the United States, which I was assigned by the Japan Society in New York. 3 years ago, when I was a participant in an international conference which was held in Boulder, Colorado, a gentleman from Washington, D.C. started his presentation by saying that an American never fails to begin his or her remarks with a joke, while Japanese always apologize for something or other first. This was either his joke or an apology for not having one. But I must admit that I agreed with him to some extent. So I'm in a feeling to apologize you something first because the timing is so difficult. When I was asked by Japan Society, I think I didn't foresee any of the collapse in the stock market in the United States, and at this moment, 10 people have 20 opinions, or more than that. So today, instead of apologizing my poor English, for instance, I would like to begin by mentioning something that you know far better than I do. Of the total exports, in terms of short tonnage, shipped from Baltimore in 1986, 14% consisted of cargoes bound for Japan. Coal and animal fats are two major items that accounted for more than 90% of the export to Japan from here. As for imports offloaded at Baltimore, only 5% were from Japan. Automobiles, steel and machinery were the major items. These figures taught me some interesting lessons. First of all, they are not a calendar year statistics, but rather are the fiscal year statistics. Fiscal year here means the Japanese fiscal year, which starts in April and ends in March. These were the only figures I could obtain in Tokyo before I leave. If I have had time to call the appropriate office of, for instance, the city government of Kawasaki, your sister city in Japan, I might have been able to obtain figures that were more familiar to you. Anyway, in Japan, they do things the Japanese way. They even convert the time covered by US statistics originally for their own conveniences. And second lesson, the second lesson I learned from this is that Baltimore docks received mostly Japanese manufactured products, while the exports from out of Baltimore consisted overwhelmingly of raw materials. This is a problem our two nations should try to solve. I would like you to keep this in mind as a background for the subject on which I'm going to speak this evening. As I see it, the economic relationship between the United States and Japan has been becoming more and more interdependent in recent years. Until a decade ago, we thought that Japanese economy alone was dependent on the US economy for various reasons. The US economy is, by of its own nature, self-sufficient. The Japanese economy, on the other hand, cannot survive without US market, which has been true ever since modernization began in the Meiji era. This basic picture remains unchanged even at this moment. The economies of our two nations have become to be more closely related in the past several decades, however. To take an example, in August 1971, when the Nixon administration established new import surcharges, the Japanese manufacturing industries were extremely hard hit by abrupt increase of their effective export prices. The US manufacturers and consumers, on the contrary, were not very much affected by this policy and continued to carry out their operations and consumption patterns without much dependence on imported goods. To the best of my knowledge, there were very few imported manufactured products that US suppliers could not provide. Among those few goods that could not be replaced by the US suppliers was the gear assembly for 10-speed bicycles, a minor item. The US government granted a waiver of import surcharge to one particular Japanese manufacturer as a special favor to our US bicycle assemblers. The situation is no longer the same. Thus, in recent years, more selective measures to curb Japanese imports have been implemented, such as so-called voluntary restraints of exports on certain targeted items. Sometimes, more fundamental solutions to bring the bilateral trade balance into equilibrium have been sought, such as the multilateral currency realignment, which was recently took place in, as you might remember, in September 1985. In addition to these, there is another move in some part of the world, and the United States as well, namely protectionism. These three factors have combined and encouraged Japanese investment in the United States in the past several years. In this sense, the subject assigned to me is somewhat socio-political concern of our two nations, which is far too difficult to deal with through an application of the pure economic theory of investment decision-making. For this reason, I would like to focus primarily on the so-called direct investment from Japan to the United States. The term direct investment stands for the capital outflow made in order to own, manage, or control any business entity or real property outside of home country. I will start with a quick review on the present situation of Japanese investment in this category in general, and then those investments in the United States in particular. Following this review, I will examine some of the aspects of the direct investment by Japanese business corporations in the United States so that we can get a better perspectives for the future. Now, let me take a look at Japanese direct investment overseas in 1980s. The direct investment by Japanese corporations outside of Japan have increased very significantly since 1980. According to the official statistics, these investments, subject to the notification requirements of the Japanese government, exceeded $10 billion US for the first time in history in fiscal year 1984, which ended, as I mentioned earlier, on March 31st, 1985. They grew further in the following 12 months to $12.2 billion. In fiscal 1986, the dollar amount of these investments almost doubled from the previous fiscal year and reached $22.3 billion. Of course, this sharp increase in dollar amount of these investments reflected to some extent the dramatic change in the relationship between the dollar and yen, which took place right after the so-called Plaza Monetary Accord in September 1985. It should be noted, however, that the figures I just mentioned only include the direct overseas investment that require notification to the government. Exchange-free investments are not included in these statistics. If we take such investments as those financed through offshore capital markets or the reinvestments of profits generated by the existing overseas subsidiaries or affiliates into account, the total volume of direct overseas investments conducted by Japanese firms would be much larger than the officially listed statistical figures. There are three characteristics regarding Japanese direct investment overseas. First, The non-manufacturing industries have shown a remarkable increase in the dollar amount of overseas investment in the direct form. In fiscal 1980, these investments of non-manufacturing industries accounted for 59%, while manufacturing industries occupied 36%. There are some 4 to 5% residuals representing the establishment of branch offices and so forth. Anyway, if we compare these percentages with the data for fiscal 1986, we'll find significant changes in the segmental composition. The overseas direct investment by Japanese non-manufacturing industries comprised more than 80%, while manufacturing industries' contribution was only 17% of the total Japanese direct investment overseas. Among all categories, the financial services industries, including insurance companies, was fastest growing industry in the area of direct overseas investment. In 1980, the financial services industry, having invested in 35 cases worth a total amount of $380 million, accounted for only 8% of Japan's direct overseas investment. In 1986, the industry invested in 274 cases, amounting to $7.2 billion. Accordingly, the percentile figure of the industry rose to 32%. The average amount of investment in the financial services industry in fiscal 1986, namely $26 million, was relatively large if we compare this to $4 million. That was the average for the manufacturing industry. The second characteristics of Japanese direct investment overseas is that the main players among the manufacturing industries have changed from the so-called labor-intensive or natural resources-oriented industries to the assembling or technology-oriented industries. For instance, in 1980, still reflecting the Japanese fiscal year, the former category of industry, such as foods, textile, lamp and pulp, chemical, and iron steel, occupied 60% of the total of the manufacturing industries. In 1986, the latter, such as machinery, electric appliances, and automobiles, occupied more than 2/3 of the total for all manufacturers. I don't think it is necessary for us to examine the forces behind these rapid changes. Quite obviously, the changing marketplace and some of the new conditions in the international political environment most likely caused it. The third of the characteristics is the change in the geographic distribution of those investments. Japanese direct investment in the United States kept up fairly stable pace of growth in the first half of 1980s. The U.S. took up a little less than 1/3 of Japan's overall direct investment to overseas in each corresponding fiscal year. In 1986, however, the Japanese direct investment to the United States jumped to 46% of total overseas investment, and the dollar amount increased almost 7 times the investment amount of 1980. This brings up to the topic I would like to cover next. According to the statistics provided by the U.S. Department of Commerce, the total outstanding balance of direct investment in the United States by foreigner at the end of 1985 was some $182 billion. Among the investing countries, the United Kingdom and Netherlands were, as you know, the two leading nations. They held 44% between them of the foreign direct investment outstanding in the United States as of that date. Japan emerged as the third largest investor in the middle of the 1980s, with an outstanding direct investment balance of $19 billion. At the end of 1970, Japan held only 1.7% of the direct investment outstanding in the United States from the rest of the world. Even a decade later, as of December 31st, 1980, Japan held only $7.7 billion in direct investment in the United States, which represented 5.7% of the total of such investment from outside. Japan's position at that time came after Canada, Germany, Switzerland, and France, as well as the two leading nations. In addition to this rapid growth of direct investment, if we take into account such portfolio investments as U.S. government securities, the capital outflow from Japan to the United States has been more tremendous in recent years. Japanese official statistics for the international balance of payment indicate that in 1986, there was a $49 billion capital outflow of U.S. securities. Compare this to the direct investment to the United States in the same calendar year, which was only $8 billion. Returning to the original issue of direct investment, Japan has so far characterized by the dominant role of its commerce. Of total Japanese direct investment outstanding at the end of 1985, 62% was represented by commerce, which is largely classified as wholesalers, typically called trading firms or sogo shosha in Japanese. Manufacturing industries occupied only 14%, while these industries held 1/3 of the outside world's direct investment to the United States as of the same date. The fact is that Japanese direct investment in the United States was still at the threshold stage at the end of 1985 in comparison with its European counterparts. The situation is changing, however. The three basic factors that emerged in the 1980s, that is, voluntary restraints of Japanese automobile exports, the sharp increase in the value of Japanese yen, and rising protectionism against Japanese products, have driven many Japanese manufacturers to set up operation in the United States. I think it is worthwhile to take a closer look at Japanese manufacturing investment in the United States. First, as I mentioned earlier, the recent trade within the major investing segments of increase by the assembly industries and technology-oriented industries among Japanese manufacturing investment as a whole can also be found in their investment in the United States. A good illustration is the automobile industry, all of the major Japanese automobile manufacturers have decided to establish plants in the United States, with several of them being in operation already. Second, Japanese-owned U.S. manufacturing subsidiaries were generally small in size. According to a survey by a Japanese journal, out of 218 subsidiaries which are engaged in manufacturing activities in the United States, 125 had fewer than 200 employees. Only 18 subsidiaries had more than 1,000 employees. This situation is also changing as the size of investment grows. Third, the geographic distribution of Japanese-owned manufacturing subsidiaries should be mentioned again. So far, there has been a large degree of concentration of these subsidiaries in the West Coast states. According to a study conducted by JETRO, the Japanese External Trade Organization, a semi-governmental trade promotion association. We are still trying to promote export. Out of 545 Japanese-owned plants in the United States as of April 1986, 183 were located in California and 40 in the state of Washington. New York State has 30 such plants, and New Jersey had 28. Those 4 states have more than half of those Japanese-owned plants. Recent developments have also changed this situation. As can be seen in the location of the Japanese automobile manufacturing plants in the United States, the Midwest and the Southeastern states are attracting more Japanese manufacturers than before. As of the date of the JETRO study, only 12 states had no Japanese representation in the manufacturing sector, and 3/4 of them were states in the Northern Plains and Southwest. Fourth, the objectives of Japanese manufacturing corporations to launch operation in the United States can be classified into 4 categories. The most commonly found one is an investment to maintain or expand a company's market share by responding to U.S. consumers' need and convenience in a more appropriate manner. These investments usually followed marketing efforts in the United States to sell the products they exported from Japan. As their export increased, they found it became advantageous to engage in local production so that they could better meet the U.S. consumers' particular needs with respect to, for instance, design, delivery, and so forth. In certain cases, local production is becoming more advantageous than exporting when the transportation cost and customs clearance fees are taken into account. If the dollar declines further against yen, there will be some additions to the number of Japanese companies who find advantages in local productions for cost reasons. Another objectives of direct investment can be observed as typical in the cases of color TV plants in the late 1970s and the automobile manufacturing plant in 1980s. These were investments not primarily based on economic rationality, but a result of forces that led these firms to decide to invest for other reasons. Their initiatives were mainly to defend their market or market positions and their sales networks, which those Japanese corporations had built up over the years as they were exporting. We may also include the Japanese-owned semiconductor plant in this category. In addition to these two types of objectives, there is a certain kind of Japanese direct investment in the United States for which the objective is to provide U.S. corporations with Japanese technologies or an attempt to develop a new market by acquiring a U.S. firm and setting up a de novo plant without any prior export experience. In practice, the operational result of the manufacturing subsidiaries vary depending on, among other things, the types of objectives that the parent company conceived at the time of its investment decision. Next, I want to examine the performance of such Japanese subsidiaries doing business in the United States in conjunction with a few other important factors affect their operations. Japanese-owned business firms in the United States, on average, performed very well in 1985. According to the survey of current business released by U.S. Department of Commerce, the return on annual turnover for all foreign-owned subsidiaries in the United States was 4.6% in 1985. The same ratio for Japanese-owned firms was 9.7% in the same year. But the situation would be the reverse if we focus only on the manufacturing subsidiaries. While Canadian and European-owned firms engaged in manufacturing in the United States showed a return on sales of 9.3% and 9.7% respectively, Japanese-owned manufacturing subsidiaries were operating in the red. They collectively lost nearly $200 million in 1985. This illustrates the difficulties Japanese manufacturers are encountering in the U.S. market. There is another reason why Japanese manufacturing industries and its subsidiaries in the United States have had such a particularly hard time. With a significantly large size of investment in the past several years, Japanese-owned firms can generally be said to be still in the process of gaining a foothold. For example, of the 218 manufacturing subsidiaries which I mentioned earlier, nearly one-third were established after 1981. These subsidiaries are, with some exceptions of course, suffering losses. The group that entered the United States by late 1970s, by contrast, is enjoying favorable operational results. However, the average size of the investment in the case of the latter is much smaller than the former. Thus, the losses incurred by the former offset the gain of the latter. Among the manufacturing subsidiaries which showed good performance, only a few paid dividends to their parent firms. Most of the profits were retained in the United States for reinvestment. As their production grew, the ratio of local content also went up, in most cases for various reasons. Parts and other materials that were originally supplied by the Japanese parent firms are being replaced gradually. Moreover, the parent companies are facing a reduction in the book value of their investment from time to time. For instance, a company that invested $20 million at 250 yen per US dollar entered 5 billion Japanese yen in their books at the time of the investment. Excuse me. The current book value of this investment should be $3 billion. The company must observe the exchange difference, a not insignificant 2 billion yen. In summary, Japanese manufacturing companies with US subsidiaries seem in general to be less satisfied so far, since they have received virtually no dividends. Their export as well as their supply of parts and other materials are being replaced by local production and local procurements. And finally, they have to deal with exchange rate losses. Although there's no clear picture at this moment, I'm personally rather optimistic about the future of manufacturing investment from Japan to the United States. Viewing the future against the background of the past 4 or 5 years does not always afford the best perspective. More recent developments indicate that this flow of capital is now hard to interrupt. 3 major factors encouraging Japanese manufacturers' investments can be pointed out. First of all, the effort of individual states to invite Japanese direct investment are a very important factor in leading Japanese companies to reach a decision to invest overseas. Some of the incentives offered by the state governments, including infrastructure schemes, are one of the key considerations in deciding a new plant locations. The second factor is the Japanese manufacturers' concern about the so-called bilateral trade friction. As a preventive manner, various types of manufacturing industries are becoming more seriously interested in local production, even if they are not the specific target of any of the trade issues. The third factor is a rapid upward valuation of the yen against the dollar. The high value of the yen is serving to make the U.S. production more competitive with export from Japan than has been the case thus far. In other words, under the current yen-dollar exchange rate, which was 138 yen and 50 for $1 US, today, that is a historical high for Japanese yen and historical low for US dollar. The production cost of certain items is coming to be identical in both Japan and the United States. Excuse me. For optimism to prevail about the future of Japanese manufacturing investment in the United States, there are certain conditions necessary if successful results are to be realized. Among others, the most fundamental and important is the relative stability of the exchange rate. What the level of that stability is likely to be is, of course, almost impossible to forecast. with any degree of confidence. As we look ahead from the vantage point of the late 1987, possibly, and one would hope to be correct, the most that can be said is that the yen will likely tend to remain more stable over the next 2 years than during the last 2 years. And probably the range will be some between 150 and 125, or thereabout. Let me now try to move away from this tricky and speculative subject as soon as possible, with your permission. I would like to then to cover those other points which seem to be leading Japanese manufacturers to successful investment. The first of these is the so-called trend of gradualism. This involves two separate concepts. One is that the local communities, as well as the Japanese parent companies, are expected to give the local management at least 10 years before they are expected to reach their full capacities of operations and earning profit. The other concept is to start with a relatively small size of investment and to phase in the following stages gradually. This is recommendable because it serves to reduce the initial risk of investment. The second point in successful investment is localization. In most cases, Japanese manufacturing subsidiaries are equipped with Japanese-made tools and machineries. If this were not done, they would find it very difficult to meet the quality standards required by their Japanese parent companies. Since their products are sold with the Japanese parents' brand names, this requirement seems to be fairly based. As for the type of management, two opposite systems can be found. One is the introduction of the Japanese way of management and the Japanese managers. In some cases, American managers, including top management, took over the responsibility from Japanese managers when everybody got accustomed to the Japanese style of management. So far as I have observed, both types of cases have proven successful. The other way is to assign the management to American executive from the very beginning. This method has encountered some difficulties, especially in the case of industries that are traditionally core industries of the United States. That is only natural. Localization has certain other aspects that can be observed. One is the procurement of parts and other materials. The market principle predominates this area. As long as quality is reliable, as long as prices are competitive, there is no reason local procurement cannot take the place of what the parent firm supplied. Another area related to localization is the labor forces. Needless to say, the issue lies not so much in the quality or quantity of labor force as in this situation with respect to labor unions. As you might have observed, Japanese companies in general used to be very concerned about U.S. labor unions. In my view, however, such sentiment is now changing and should change. I believe this is one of the shallows they have to wade through, even though shallows often become rapids. Because I'm a fisherman, I know very well. But this is simply something they will have to do, in my own opinion. The third and the last major factor in the public is the public interest. Unless Japanese manufacturing subsidiaries produce benefits for the U.S. public in such ways as offering greater convenience, increased competition, or gains in efficiency, they will not have any grounds to claim the support of the people. Without the support of the people of the United States, they cannot be successful. Those manufacturers from Japan that are or will soon be operating in the United States must concern themselves with the public benefit. At the same time, they try to ensure successful operational results. And I trust that my Japanese countrymen are wise and able enough to do this. At the community level, it is also very important for Japanese managers to contribute to the community in which they operate. I'm thoroughly convinced that they are genuinely concerned with the local community needs, since they have had a similar experience in Japan. Of course, there might be some difficulties because of the differences of culture. I have faith in and respect for the American people, not only because of their generous nature, but also for their eagerness to combine the best elements of many different cultures. Newly arriving Japanese managers will soon learn to do in America as the Americans do. In concluding my remarks, I would briefly like to mention several points which I believe to be important for both countries. The Japanese investment in the United States and, of course, the U.S. investment in Japan are signs of interdependency and intimate relationship of the two nations' economies. We should not regard this wave of capital flows as a doctor's prescription to cure a certain type of disease. As long as there is a lack of a rational basis, the continued success of any economic behavior cannot be guaranteed. As for Japanese direct investment and manufacturing investment in particular, one final thing should be mentioned. Not only industrial products made in Japan, but also management systems developed in Japan are being tested in the U.S. market. This means the advent of a new type of competition between the U.S. corporations and their Japanese counterparts. Both will benefit from this new environment by learning something from the other. In my view, this is the greatest meaning of the increasing direct investment by Japanese companies in the United States market. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Well, indeed, thank you, sir. A very comprehensive and clear presentation. We'll entertain questions until 10 minutes after, sir. Yes, sir.
One has the impression that most of the Japanese investment in the United States is being carried out by large corporations, large trading companies, what we call big business. What is your observation about the interest of Japanese, what we would call small business or medium-sized business, in coming into the United States? And if they do come, do they use the services of a bank such as yours, or do they use other services, such as trading companies, to help them get established here?
The question is,
Do small Japanese businesses as well as large Japanese businesses seek to come to the United States? And if so, do they use the services of American banks as well as yours?
Or trading firms of Japan. To take an example of the Japan's major automobile manufacturers, once they decide to set up the manufacturing plant in certain states of the United States, the part suppliers, mostly medium or smaller sized, have to face a very, very difficult decision making, whether or not to follow. If they don't follow the automobile assemblers, that means they will lose certain portion of their own market. But if they do follow, they will have to develop their own experience or knowledge. They are mostly very domestic so far. So it is a very crucial decision making for those medium-sized firms that are closely related to major automobile manufacturers. And in most cases, they have decided or they will decide to follow their automobile assemblers. And so I think there is a number of smaller, medium and smaller Japanese firms coming to the United States, even at this moment and the year after. And the other areas is, if I take an example, the other area is Japanese supermarkets, having certain entities, especially in California. And in those cases, your second point is who is supposed to serve them. And it is a very difficult question in generalized form. But I think in case of the automobile part suppliers, mostly the Japanese banks are the first one who seems to be of service to them. And in case of the independent medium-sized firms, they are more likely to be dependent on the trading firms because they have the long years relationship with regard to their own export to the U.S. market. And they have no representation here in the United States, and trading firms as a commission merchant act as an agent for them for long years. So quite naturally, trading firms will take out them. So it depends upon the case, I think.
Ms. Compton?
I would be interested in knowing what the types of, you mentioned the schemes that states have to offer. If you could give us an example of the types of things that you feel are, you are looking for, that your companies are looking for. And also if you have comparable figures on the American investment in Japan.
The first question is, what should Maryland be prepared to do to attract Japanese business? And the second question is, what is American investment in Japan like?
It is also a very difficult question to generalize. But to the best of my knowledge, one of the major concerns of the Japanese business firms who have the plans to set up certain manufacturing plant in the United States is, first of all, the convenience of inland transportations of their products. So that is the reason why most of the firms are trying to be gathered together in the Chicago area or certain states down south, where the highway system have the convenient connections. And in answering your question about the so-called infrastructure schemes that will be offered by the state government, one of the major interests would be the some of the tax exemption status or tax exemption fundraising operations, such as municipal bonds and so and so. That is one of the very unprofitable business for securities firms right now. However, if there is no tax benefits for various fields, such states have certain degree of disadvantage to attract the Japanese firms. And one thing I would like to mention is, in certain cases, when they are trying to send a significant number of Japanese employees to their new plants, the school education is one of the major concern of them. And as for the cases of the U.S. investment in Japan, and as far as I know, the major components of the U.S. investment in Japan are the financial services industries, okay, and mostly gathered to the certain limited portion of Tokyo. So I don't think there is much problem of the infrastructure issues.
Yes, sir, in the first row.
Could you comment on what effect the decline in the Japanese, Tokyo and the Wall Street stock markets might have on Japanese investment in this country?
Would you comment upon the decline of Wall Street investment in the United States?
I do appreciate if you can comment on it. And that is the question I am afraid of before I arrived at Baltimore Station this afternoon. And if I generalize in this way, as high as the Japanese yen valued against US dollars, that means, as I mentioned in my remarks, the more Japanese firms would find the competitive edges in their possible investment and possible local productions.